Assalamualaikum. I hope everybody is doing okay. Before we start with the last chapter before the mids, let's just talk about the things we've covered so far. Microeconomics के first half में we planned to cover microeconomics, and microeconomics को हमने start इस तरह किया था कि we started off by talking about different models of economics. इसमें हमने we talked about the circular flow diagram which represented the economy, and then we talked about the budget constraint. And उसके बाद we talked about the market forces of demand and supply and how the demand and supply curves shift and how movement along the curves happen. Then we talked about elasticity and how it was important, and we also talked about the importance of trade and how it helped us move to a point that was beyond our budgetary constraint. And we talked about different advantages, comparative, and absolute. And we also talked about theories on costs, in which we discussed different types of costs. And then we talked about the economies of scale and how the decision to actually stop production was made. Now the last thing that we want to cover is going to be the theory of consumer choice. Basically, economics, the microeconomics वाला component was about how firms and households and the government, they're all trying to maximize something. तो हमने कहा था कि जी कंज्यूमर होता है वो अपनी खुशी को मैक्सिमाइज़ करने की कोशिश कर रहा होता है. द प्रोड्यूसर इज़ ट्राइंग टू मिनिमाइज हिज कॉस्ट, मैक्सिमाइज हिज प्रॉफिट. द गवर्नमेंट इज़ ट्राइंग टू मैक्सिमाइज द वेलफेयर दैट इट कैन एक्चुअली गिव टू द पीपल. So this particular chapter is going to be talking about how consumers decide कि हमने किस तरह कंज्यूम करना है किस चीज़ को in order to maximize their happiness. So this chapter is going to be going back to the budget constraint, the second model that we saw on the first slides, and it's going to be using that to actually help us in figuring out how decisions are made by consumers. If you recall, तो हमने कहा था कि economics is about how people manage their scarce or limited resources. And we said कि with a given set of resources, there is a limit to what the economy can produce. And you have to produce within this limit. So starting off, since हमने कहा है कि हमारे पास resources limited हैं, तो we will be facing trade-offs कि यार ये चीज़ बनाएं या the other thing. So slide talks about how people face trade-offs, और इसमें basically the idea is to get something, you have to give something up. And slide number 2 talks about if you buy one more good, it leaves less income to buy the other goods. If you work more hours, उससे आपकी इनकम तो बढ़ जाएगी लेकिन like वो लेजर टाइम कम हो जाएगा. And similarly, how if you decide to consume more now, you have less consumption in the future because आपने अपनी saving कम कर दी है. So the chapter is basically about the consumer deciding to consume between two things. Two things are used so that we can simplify the problem, and we can plot it on a graph. And this chapter is going to be a lot of graphs once again. We'll start off with the budget constraint and then move on to the indifference curve, which is going to represent the consumer's satisfaction levels, and then see how these two are combined together to actually make the decision to consume between the two goods. किस ratio में आपने actually consumption करनी. The budget constraint basically tells you the limit of what can be consumed by the consumer. So हमने production possibility frontier की बात की थी. Since now we are talking about consumer theory, this production possibility frontier is going to be very similar to that. and this budget constraint is basically the limit on the consumption bundles that a consumer can actually afford because उसकी resources limited हैं. So rather than talking about production at the moment, we're talking about consumption, and we're saying कि यार किसी consumer की income जो है वो limited है. Since उसकी income limited है, तो there is a limit to how much he can consume. So this example is basically about this person who's actually using his income to buy either mangoes या फिर fish. Either one or the other or a mix of both. And he needs to decide कि किस combination के अंदर मैंने consumption करनी है. So she has two things to choose between, fish and mangoes, and she needs to decide कि यार किस ratio में मैंने using my income I want to buy fish and I want to buy mangoes, right? And this combination is called the consumption का bundle, right? So 40 fish, 300 mangoes. So ये combination. So this first learning activity is basically about making a budget constraint. And if you look at this, वो कह रहा है कि this person has an income of $1,200 और $1,200 को इस्तेमाल करके उसने he has to decide कि मैंने कितनी fish इस्तेमाल करनी है, कितनी mangoes खरीदने हैं. So these four activities are going to help you actually come up with a budget constraint. The first one is कि if he decides कि मैंने सारी income इस्तेमाल करके खाली fish खरीदनी है, and fish की price ऊपर दी हुई है वो $4 है. So if she decides to only buy fish, then that would mean कि 1200 को 4 से divide करेंगे तो you come up with a value of 300, probably 300 I think. And that would mean that if she spent all her money on fish, she'd be able to buy 300 fish. So if you recall computers or cars ki example, on the x-axis you have activity A ke andar you have 300 fish, right? So if she only decides to have 0 mangoes and only fish, she can actually consume 300 fish with all the money that she has. On the other end of the spectrum, if she decides कि मैंने सारी की सारी इनकम इस्तेमाल करके मैंगोस खरीदने हैं, तो कितने मैंगोस खरीद सकती है? एक मैंगो $1 का है, $1200 उसके पास है, so she can buy $1,200 mangoes. So this is similar to the production possibility frontier that we've already covered. Part C is if she decides to buy 100 fish, how many mangoes can she buy? 100 fish would cost her 100 into 4. That would mean 400. पीछे रह जाएगा कितना? 800. So एक मैंगो $1 का है तो 800 fish लिस्ट देगी वो. So if you plot all of these together, $400 for the fish, 800 left with which you can buy mangoes. You come up with something called her budget constraint. If you think about it, this is very similar to the production possibility frontier that we've talked about in chapter number 1. The production, when we were talking about the firm, we said that your production depends on the amount of resources you have. Now we're talking about the consumer's consumption decision, and this is pretty similar, and it's saying that using the income that you have, there is a constraint to how much you can buy, and that is defined by this budget constraint, which means that she can use a combination of 400 mangoes and 50 fish, but वो अपनी सारी की सारी income इस्तेमाल नहीं कर रही होगी. This means that if she's on the line on this budget constraint, she's using all of her income. This means that you cannot go beyond this budget line because she doesn't have the money to do it. So once we figured this out, if you recall for the production possibility frontier, तो हमने ये कहा था कि जी is there a way to increase our production? हमने कहा था technology अगर improve हो जाए तो you can actually increase the there is a shift in the production possibility frontier. Similarly, in the budget constraint as well, if the price of fish or mango changes, this budget constraint can either rotate or actually shift, but it depends on what's happening. So let's go on to the next one. So before we move forward, we want to talk about the slope of the budget constraint. What is the slope of the budget constraint saying? So the idea is कि if you decide कि मैंने C से D पे जाना है, so you're moving from point C to point D. This means you're giving up 200 mangoes. 800 से आप जा रहे हैं 600 के ऊपर mangoes के ऊपर, and you trading these 200 mangoes for extra 50 fish, and that's the slope. So this means that she has to give up 4 mangoes to get 1 fish. So this is the simple slope ka formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, and we want to figure out what is the slope of the budget constraint. The slope of the budget constraint is called the relative price. Okay, how much mangoes must be given up to get an extra quantity of fish. याद ये रखना है कि you're talking about how much of y-axis you're giving up to get an extra x, because if you recall the formula of the slope, y ऊपर आता है, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we're saying यार, to get 1 additional fish, how many mangoes must I give up? And this is called the relative price. So now we're talking about what happens when one of the factors जिसके through आप budget constraint बना रहे थे changes. So if you recall, we said कि जी in the production possibility frontier हमने कहा था अगर आपकी resources बढ़ जाएं, the production possibility moves outwards. If the price of one of those goods, the cost of making one of the goods changes, the production possibility frontier moves up or down. The first example over here is if his income falls to $800. Since आपकी income कम हो गया, that means कि obviously you'll be able to consume less. So ₹1 का मैंगो जो पहले 1200 इनकम थी तो 1200 खरीद सकते थे, since अब 800 हो गई है तो you can only buy 800 of them. Similarly, fish की भी if you're only talking about fish, तो पहले 300 थे तो अब now you can only buy 200 of the fish. So there is a shift in the budget constraint. So income falling means the budget constraint shifts inwards. And if the income had increased, it would have moved outwards. The second part of the activity was what happens if the price of the mango increases. पहले price ₹1 की थी, ₹1 का एक mango था, $1 का एक mango था. If it increases to $2, this means कि using the $1200 that he had, he'd be able to actually consume less. पहले $1 से 1200 mangoes खरीद सक रहा था. Now he'd probably be able to only buy 600 of them because the price जो है वो 2 होगी. That would mean कि आपकी जो ये curve है mango की, जो पहले 1200 थी अब 600 पे आ गई. Notice the slope is smaller. The relative price of fish has now gone to only 2 mangoes. अब हुआ क्या है? If you recall, हमने कहा था the slope has decreased. What does this mean? The relative price of fish is now only 2 mangoes. Going back to the previous slide, जिसमें हमने कहा था ये relative price होती है. Over here we said the slope was the relative price. और हमने ये कहा था कि जी in order to get an extra fish, she must give up 4 mangoes. 4 mangoes must be given up to get 1 extra fish. So a fish की relative price was actually 4 mangoes. 4 mangoes was actually equal to one additional fish. Now that the slope has changed, this means that for one additional fish, only 2 mangoes have to be given up. I hope uh, you get this. Acha ji, now that we've talked about shifts in the budget constraint and the rotation in the budget constraint, we said कि जी अगर income बढ़ेगी तो there will be a shift in the budget constraint. If the price of one of the two goods changes, it causes a rotation or a pivoting effect of the budget constraint. So now that we've talked about the budget constraint, we need to talk about the indifference curve. Since we're trying to maximize the consumer's level of satisfaction, we need a way to actually represent the level of the consumer satisfaction, and that is going to be represented by the indifference curve. If you can see in the slide. So this what this indifference curve is basically saying is, okay, if I had, let's say, 50 fish and 50 mangoes, I'd be happy to say, let's say, I have 10% happy. I'm just making this up. But I'd be equally happy if I had 70 mangoes and only 30 fish. So this indifference curve shows different combinations of consumption bundles at which the consumer has the same level of satisfaction. So once again, what I'm saying is, if I had 50 fish and 50 mangoes, I'd be 15% happy. But if I had, say, 70 mangoes and 30 fish, I'd be equally happy, because now I have, although I have less fish, but I have more mangoes, so I'm still 15% happy. So this indifference curve shows you different combinations of mangoes and fish at which the consumer is equally happy. Equally happy basically means he's indifferent. He's like saying, मुझे A दे दो या B दे दो. I'm equally happy. So A and B in all the bundles on this indifference curve represented by I1 make Hurley equally happy. He's indifferent between them. So using this, this is going to be telling you the happiness level of the consumer, right? Now there are some properties of the indifference curve that we need to talk about. Then we'll bring it down back to the budget constraint and see how the consumer decides to consume stuff. So the first property is that the indifference curves are downward sloping. If the quantity of fish is reduced, the quantity of mangoes must go up to keep Hurley equally happy. The second property is K. The higher the indifference curve, the happier you are. So between these three indifference curves that you see over here, I0, 1, 2, I would prefer to be in point C, because at point C on a indifference curve I2, I'm consuming more fish and more mangoes than, say, D, where I'm consuming less mangoes and less fish overall. Hurley prefers every bundle in I2 to every bundle in I1, because basically what we're saying is, okay, on a higher indifference curve, in total she's happier because she's getting more fish and mangoes combined than lower indifference curves. So people prefer to be on a higher indifference curve. Higher indifference curves means higher satisfaction. So you'd want to be on a higher indifference curve. So higher indifference curves are preferred to lower ones. The third property is कि जो indifference curves हैं ये आपस में cross नहीं कर सकती, because if you look at this diagram over here, indifference curve 4 and 1, if point A lies on both these indifference curves, that means कि इन दोनों indifference curves का I4 का and I1 का, if you look at point A, this means you're indifferent, which means कि C और A की level satisfaction same है, whereas B और A की भी level of satisfaction same है. This cannot happen. So indifference curves cannot cut. The slide says Hurley should prefer B to C because that's what we said. Okay, higher indifference curves are preferred, right? But over here, what's going on is that although B should be better than C, but B is equal to A and C is also equal to A. If they cross, then the previous property does not hold. The last one is that the indifference curves are bowed inwards. Hurley is willing to give up more mangoes for a fish if he has fewer fish. The idea is agar fish come hai, for an additional fish he's saying yaar, okay, I'm willing to give up more mangoes because mere paas fish come hai. When she has a lot of fish, she's not willing to give up too many mangoes for an additional fish because if you look at point B, उसके पास mangoes कम है लेकिन fish ज़्यादा है. For an extra fish, she's not willing to give up too many mangoes. That's why this indifference curve is down, is bowed inward. So char properties in downward sloping, you prefer the higher one, they cannot intersect, and they're bowed inwards. That we need to remember for indifference curves. Yeah, so the slope of the budget constraint we said was the relative price. Now, when we're talking about the indifference curves, we're saying that we want to substitute mangoes for fish. Okay, we at point A for additional fish, we're willing to actually give up 6 mangoes, and this is called the marginal rate of substitution. The rate at which the consumer is willing to trade off one good for the other. Right? How many mangoes are you willing to give up for an additional fish? If you recall the budget constraint के ऊपर ये this was relative price. Right? Hurley's marginal rate of substitution is the amount of mangoes he would substitute for another fish. एक extra fish के लिए he is willing to give up 6 mangoes. That's his marginal rate of substitution. Okay, I want to substitute mangoes for fish. Then I'm willing to give up 6 mangoes for one additional fish. But as you move downwards, when the number of fish that he has increases, he's saying कि यार मेरे पास fish ज़्यादा होती जा रही है, I'm not, and mangoes कम होते जा रहे हैं. So I'm willing to give up less mangoes for one additional fish because I already have a lot of fish. Acha, so if you recall, there are things called complements and substitutes. Substitutes are those goods that can be interchangeably used, while complements are used together. So there are two extreme cases of indifference curves, and these are the cases in which these two goods जिनकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, over here we were talking about mangoes and fish. What happens when these two things, because these two things can change, what happens when these two things are perfect substitutes or perfect complements? Perfect substitute का मतलब है कि you can just give one up for the other one, and the perfect complement का मतलब ये है कि जी they have to be used together. In that case, in the case of perfect substitutes, which is a nickel and a dime, so 2 nickels is equal to 1 dime. So if somebody gave you 2 nickels versus say 1 dime, they're actually giving you the same amount of money. So you have the satisfaction of one dime. If somebody gives you two dimes versus four nickels, they're actually the same thing. So in the case of perfect substitutes, आपकी इंडिफरेंस कर्व्स बिल्कुल फ्लैट हो जाती हैं, बिकॉज कोई मुझे एक डाइम दे या दो निकल्स दे, मुझे ₹1 एक टाइम दे रहा है in real terms, so I'm equally happy, right? So your indifference curve becomes flat. In case of perfect complements, यहाँ पे एग्जांपल जूते की है. If I had 5 लेफ्ट शूज़ एंड 5 राइट शूज़, मेरी हैप्पीनेस लेवल 5 जूतों के पेयर की इक्वल होती. लेकिन अगर मेरे पास 5 राइट शूज़ होते और 7 लेफ्ट शूज़ होते, तो दीज एक्स्ट्रा 2 शूज़ वुड बी यूजलेस, बिकॉज वो एक्स्ट्रा 2 जूतों का मैं क्या करता लेफ्ट शूज़ का. So my happiness level would still be at the happiness level of 5 shoes. So in case of perfect complements, the indifference curve becomes right angles. And so this slide basically represents the fact that as these two goods x and y, when they become closer to perfect complements, the curve starts to move inwards, and in the end, for perfect complements, it's right angles. For substitutes, when they're not perfect substitutes, the close substitutes, the indifference curve is not bowed too much. So this is actually flattening. It's moving in this direction. As these two goods become more of perfect complements, it should be moving inwards. All right. So now that we've talked about both the budget constraint and the indifference curves, we'll be combining these two concepts together to figure out what combination of mangoes and fish the consumer actually chooses. So if you recall from the previous slides that the slope of the indifference curve was called the marginal rate of substitution. It was how many mangoes were you willing to substitute for an additional fish, while the slope of this curve, the budget constraint, was the relative price. So we're talking about the optimum, and the optimum choice is going to be the point where the relative price is going to be equal to the marginal rate of substitution. This basically means that the slope of the IC curve is going to be equal to the slope of the budget constraint, basically meaning that they are going to be tangent to each other. So A is the optimum, the point on the budget constraint that touches the highest possible indifference curve. The optimum is going to be the point which is going to be on the highest possible indifference curve between the three of them. This cannot be achieved because you're restricted by the budget constraint. This is the maximum that you can consume. Over here you are at a lower level of satisfaction. On a higher indifference curve you're happier, so you prefer to be on this indifference curve. And on this indifference curve, this is the point where the indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint, and this is the combination that is optimum for you. And at point A you are able to actually stay within your budget and able to consume 600 mangoes and 150 fish. You'd want to go to point B, but you don't have the money to actually, or the income to actually be that happy. You can't go to that indifference curve. If you were at the lower indifference curve, point C would mean you'd be able to go to point C, but if you were at point A, you'd be happier. So why be at point C? Both C and D. So if you look at point C or point D, you're on the budget constraint, but if you were at point D, you'd be happier, which means overall you're actually getting more mangoes and fish in total at point A compared to point D. So the idea of the optimum is okay, you make the budget constraint, you find out what the indifference curves look like, and you choose the point that is tangent to the budget constraint. The IC curve that is tangent to the budget constraint, that's the combination of mangoes and fish that the consumer is going to be choosing. To what happens when income changes and what happens when the price of one of these goods, mangoes or fish, change. Now, what happens when income increases? Before we go to that, this is what we have talked about earlier. The slope of the indifference curve is called the marginal rate of substitution, and the slope of your budget constraint is called the relative price. For one additional fish, how many mangoes are you willing to give up? So, marginal value of fish and this relative price of fish. Price of fish in terms of mangoes. So, for an additional fish, how many mangoes are you willing to give up? Alright, so what happens when income increases? When income increases, this means that you have more money to spend, which basically means you should be able to go to a higher level of satisfaction. Since you have more income, you can buy more and consume more. So what happens is you move to point B. What we need to understand over here is, let's suppose that you were consuming 100 mangoes over here and 100 fish. For a normal good, this normal is important over here. If you recall from our demand and supply market chapter on market forces, we said there are two kinds of goods. One of them is called an inferior good and the other one is called a normal good. Inferior good वो good था जिसको if you had more money you'd choose not to consume more because you'd want to move on to a better quality good because you were consuming an inferior good. In case of a normal good, when your income increases, you end up consuming both more mangoes and more fish. However, let's suppose that fish was an inferior good. If fish was an inferior good, what would happen is you would not want to be consuming more fish even though your income has gone up. You'd want to choose, I don't know, something else, maybe yours. So in that case, your quantity of fish would not increase. You'd move to a different point over here somewhere. Say, let's suppose here. At this point, let me see if I can get a more. You'd be at point, this point, let's call it C, and at point C you'd be consuming, oops sorry, it's at point C you'd be consuming less fish and more mangoes. That's if this fish was an inferior good. So just to recap, we said when you're consuming an inferior good and your income goes up, you decide to consume less of that inferior good. So in that case, what would happen is कि आपकी fish की quantity would decrease, but mango, since it's a normal good, आपकी income बढ़ के you'd want to consume more of that, and you'd be over here somewhere, and this is where your indifference curve would be. So once again, when your income increases, if both goods are normal goods, you buy more of each. Mangoes भी ज़्यादा खरीद लेते हैं, fish भी ज़्यादा खरीद लेते हैं. That's why this goes up and this goes up. If this was an inferior, one of them was an inferior good, so you'd be consuming more mangoes, less fish, because inferior goods with higher incomes की demand कम हो जाती है. So here's the example of the inferior goods versus the normal goods. We're saying an increase in income increases the quantity demanded for normal goods and reduces the quantity demanded for inferior goods. And now we're saying suppose fish is the normal good and mango is the inferior good. अब हम कह रहे हैं कि जो fish है वो normal good and the mango is the inferior good. We want to see what happens when Hurley की income बढ़ती है. So when your income increases, your budget constraint moves forward. Since mangoes are an inferior good, in the previous slide, I made the fish the inferior good. In this context, the mango is the inferior good. If the mango was a normal good, you'd be over here somewhere, जहाँ पे आपका mangoes भी ज़्यादा consume हो रहे हैं और fish भी ज़्यादा consume हो रही है. But since mangoes are inferior good, which is unlikely, but anyway, let's suppose it is inferior good. What would happen is that the quantity demanded by the consumer of mangoes would go down, and you'd be choosing point B. In this case, the demand for mango has gone down and a fish has gone up. So this is the second effect. What happens in the case when the price of the fish falls? So fish, which was earlier for $4, the price falls to $2. And if you recall, when such thing happens, this budget constraint rotates. And once this rotates, now you decide, since if you just to please remember that mango in this case is an inferior good. So what would happen is the quantity of fish would increase, but that of the mango would fall from 600 to 500. If this was a normal good, you'd probably be over here somewhere where you'd be consuming more fish and more mangoes. So when price falls to $2, the budget constraint rotates outwards. Hurley buys more fish and fewer mangoes. I hope you understand this. Now this is probably the most confusing part of the lecture. This effect, in which you move from this point to this point, can actually be broken down into two parts. You don't actually move directly from this point to this point. You move to a different point over here somewhere, and then you move on to the final stage. So a fall in the price of fish has two effects on the Hurley's on Hurley's optimum consumption of both goods. The first one is called the income effect. A fall in price of fish means that overall Hurley's purchasing power has gone up. She can now buy more mangoes and more fish. I hope that makes sense. Since fish सस्ती हो गई है, in overall terms, she's able to buy more of both fish and mangoes. The second effect is called the substitution effect. Now, the substitution effect is not looking into the purchasing power. All it's saying is that if the price of fish falls, this means that mangoes are more expensive now relative to the fish. And since mangoes are more expensive, Hurley buys fewer mangoes and more fish. I know this is confusing, so let me just go through this once again. हम कह रहे हैं कि whenever the price of fish changes, two effects come into play. The first one is the income effect, which is talking about purchasing power. It's saying कि यार एक गुड सस्ता हो गया, तो that means कि in real terms आप actually you can buy more of both the goods, the mango and the fish. While the substitution effect basically says कि since अब fish सस्ती हो गई है and mangoes महंगे हो गए हैं, तो you would want to buy less mangoes and more fish because fish सस्ती होती है. What actually happens is ambiguous. It depends on what kind of good the mango is. So this was the original position before we said the price of fish changed. And you were at an optimum. This optimum point was where your indifference curve was at a tangent to your budget constraint, which is also called the point where the marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of the indifference curve, is equal to the relative price, which is the slope of the budget constraint. जब price changes of fish, it means you can buy more fish now since it's cheaper. The price has fallen. Now two effects happen. The first one is called the substitution effect. The substitution effect happens is basically a movement along the original indifference curve. It is it is saying that you can move. You prefer to buy more of. You prefer to buy more of the two the one of the two goods, which basically is saying that you're moving along. So if you recall, you're equally happy on a single indifference curve. If you move from point A to point B over here, you're equally happy because if you recall from the first couple of slides on the indifference curve, we said, okay, if you're on the same indifference curve, you're equally happy. Moving to a higher indifference curve means that your level of satisfaction has gone up. The substitution effect was saying, I'm not talking about the purchasing power. An increase in a change in price of fish means one or the other good has become more expensive, and I'd rather choose more fish because mangoes now are more expensive. But how do you find out where you are on the original indifference curve? So the way it's done is that you draw a a new budget constraint that is parallel to this budget constraint. This dotted line is the new budget constraint. You draw it as a line that's parallel to this new budget constraint. This line, this dotted line is parallel to the new budget constraint, and the point where it is tangent with the original IC curve, this one, is the movement that is happening because of the substitution effect. You move from point A to point B. Because mangoes are more expensive now, you choose to consume less mangoes and more fish. The second effect that happens is that your purchasing power has gone up, which means you can purchase a higher amount of both mangoes and fish. In that case, it means you can purchase both a higher amount of fish and both a higher amount of mangoes. And that makes you move from point B to point C, which is the final choice that the consumer makes. But since in this case your mango was an inferior good, what has happened is, okay, the total quantity demanded of mangoes has gone down anyway, and there is a negative effect on mangoes ultimately. So activity number 4, 5, The last two activities, I guess. Let's talk about this. And um, okay, so this is the last active learning activity. Okay, so this is the last activity I'll be talking to you. All right, so this is the last activity I'll be doing with you, and I'll be stopping over here, and it's going to be your job to actually go through the last couple of applications. I think these few applications you have to go through, and since I've taken the time out to actually go through these for you, I'd like you to please go through them and send me a write up on what you make out of these three applications. All right, so these are two indifference curves, and the first one is of substitutes, and the second one is of complements, and they're closed complements and closed substitutes. We want to figure out what happens when there is a change in relative prices, and we're talking about the same change in the change in the relative price is by the same amount. So this was the original position, and if you recall, when the relative price changes, that means that the curve is rotating, and when it rotates, if you look at this, you find substitution effect is bigger for substitutes than for complements. Why is this important? Let's go back and take a look at this. So we said two effects happen whenever there is a change in price, the income effect and the substitution effect. The substitution effect was basically saying that since mangoes are more expensive, I want to consume less of them and more of fish. And the income effect was saying since my purchasing power has gone up, I can consume a higher amount of both of them. If these two goods were actually substitutes, the substitution effect would be larger. But if they were close complements, this effect would be smaller. And rather than moving from point A to point C, you might end up over here somewhere. The final thing that we want to talk about is that um, using this indifference curves, you can actually come up with a demand curve for either fish or for mangoes. If you recall, in this example that we're talking about, what's happening is the price of fish is changing. When the price of fish changes, the indifference curve rotates and you come up with a different combination where here what's happening is since fish is a normal good, a fall in price results in the quantity of fish increasing to a higher amount over here, which means when prices will fall, the quantity demanded for fish would be higher, and this is how we actually come up with the demand curve for fish. If you recall earlier, we came up with the demand curve by looking at demand schedule, and that's how we actually came up with the demand curve. After this, there are probably three application examples, and I'd like you guys to go through these yourselves, go through the chapters and read through it, and see if they make sense. If they don't make sense, you're most welcome to come back to me with them.